biggest earthquake ever to hit the lower 48 states was not the 6.7 Northridge quake in 1994, or the 6.9 Loma Prieta quake in 1989, or even the 7.8 San Francisco quake of 1906. But the series of 3 quakes which struck near St. Louis in 1811 and 1812. The earth didn't just shake, it discharged bizarre sand geysers, spewed strange vapors, made the Mississippi River run backwards, and sucked lakes dry.
All of a sudden, the hand of God comes down and strikes right where you're at.
For many, it seemed to be the end of the world.
These people were scared to death.
But it wasn't over. Thousands of aftershocks rattled the continent for 5 more months.
They rang church bells in Boston. They rattled China in New York. They were felt in Detroit. They were felt in Washington, D.C.
What if that same earthquake were to strike the Midwest today? The lives of at least 11 million Americans would be in peril.
The problem today is that what was an unpopulated part of America is now very populated.
It's happened before. It will happen again. The heartland of America has seen its share of natural disasters. Killer tornadoes that have destroyed buildings, and floods that have swept away entire towns. But an even greater danger may lurk beneath the fertile fields: a massive earthquake. Memphis, Tennessee sits 50 miles south of one of the most dangerous earthquake faults in America. Experts believe that when it ruptures, violent seismic motions will destroy bridges and highways throughout the Midwest.
A major quake in the New Madrid zone would create unimaginable havoc in Memphis, Tennessee, which is the closest city to the New Madrid fault and built largely of brick.
The shock will spread out at 7,000 miles per hour. The quake will critically damage an 8-state region, extending all the way to the East Coast.
I think the first reaction to an earthquake, even if you're a seismologist today, is this fundamental sense of terror. It just, out of a clear blue sky, it's like somebody's picking up your house and shaking it back and forth.
The earthquake will be accompanied by a series of frightening otherworldly events. 100-foot geysers of sand will erupt. Clouds of sulfur will choke the atmosphere. And the raging Mississippi River will be temporarily dammed and flow backwards. Major shaking will bring down structures in an area extending over 1 million square miles.
It's just unfathomable that you would have buildings over 350 miles away that would be damaged by an earthquake.
This may seem like science fiction, but it's happened before. One of America's worst earthquakes occurred 200 years ago in the heart of the country.
The mother of all earthquakes in the United States was in 1811 and 1812 in an obscure place in southern Missouri, where Missouri, Kentucky, Arkansas, and Illinois all meet, called New Madrid.
December 1811. The weather was warmer than usual in New Madrid, Missouri.
There were about 500 or 600 people living in New Madrid. It was a thriving river city. It was located on the largest S-curve in that section of the river.
A little after 2 in the morning on December 16th, the earth sort of came unglued with the first of the earthquakes.
There was a great roar that's compared in the accounts to thunder or heavy artillery, and the ground started shaking, and people were thrown from their beds, furniture was overturned, and in the middle of the night in 1811, you would have no idea what this was.
Intense seismic waves radiated in all directions for hundreds of miles.
The thing about New Madrid is that it's in the middle of a vast alluvial plain, and the seismic shocks from it spread unrestricted across certainly Eastern America.
The quake was felt as far away as New York, Boston, Montreal, and Charleston, South Carolina, where it rang the bells of St. Philip's Episcopal Church.
People went running into the street in their night clothes, and birds of all kinds were screeching and flying about. Cattle were stampeding.
With the earth convulsing, it was impossible to stand.
They threw themselves on the ground and started praying in fear. And one couple grabbed all their children, ran into the street. The mother suddenly realizes that they've left the infant behind. And she says to her husband, "Go get the baby." He starts back to the house, and the ground is shaking so badly he's thrown to the ground a dozen times before he can finally get to the house, crawl inside, reach the baby, get back out.
George Christ, living 100 miles north of New Madrid, wrote this account.
There was a great quaking of the earth this morning. Tables and chairs turned over and knocked around. All of us knocked out of bed. The roar I thought would leave us deaf. All you could hear was screams from people and animals. I don't know how we lived through it.
There were no seismographs in 1811 to record the shock. But based on eyewitness accounts and destruction reports, seismologists believe the quake measured 8.0 on the Richter scale. 10 times stronger than the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco. And the horror wasn't over. Frightened residents next confronted inexplicable large clouds of strange gas seeping from the earth.
There was a sulfurous smell which came up out of the bowels of the earth.
Escaping into the darkness, many people reported seeing bizarre flashing lights.
The lights are not unique. There are other earthquakes where people have said that they've seen them. The explanation is that it has something to do with the squeezing of the rocks. They emit electrical signals. It's called a piezoelectric effect.
After a night of terror, the sun came up. But dawn brought no relief from the tremors.
There were rumblings and shakes all through the night. And then at 7 a.m. there was another shock, at least as hard as the first and maybe worse. And it kept going all through the day.
Many homes and barns that endured the 2 a.m. shaker now clattered to the ground from this massive aftershock. With daylight, people could see the earthquake destruction.
There were also these large fissures created. Sometimes they were 4 and 5 feet across and 10 miles long. There are several accounts of buildings being swallowed up into the fissures.
Not only was the land in turmoil, the Mississippi River and lakes in the region were thrown from their banks.
There were huge disruptions along the river valleys, and the water of the Mississippi River was sloshed around like a bathtub. Banks caved in and took trees with them.
Probably the most dramatic thing that happened was a huge piece of land was thrust up. And this piece of land crossed the river. And so all this water comes downriver and hits this impediment. Well, it's like when you're in a bathtub and you push the water away from you, there's only one place it can come, back towards you. And so a 30-foot high wall of water goes rushing back upstream.
Incredibly, the mighty Mississippi flowed backwards. churning against uplifted land, it retreated from its normal course, charging back upstream toward Illinois. At 11 a.m., there was yet another massive aftershock, estimated to be close to 8 on the Richter scale. The third huge seismic event in less than 12 hours. 2 hunters near the town of Little Prairie witnessed something shocking.
They described the waters of the lake draining away in this earthquake. This area was described as a prairie. That part of the ground got lifted up in the aftershock such that this shallow lake just disappeared, and they were there watching this go on.
During these large aftershocks, the earth belched up immense quantities of sand and debris from unusual gaping fissures in the ground. Geologists call these strange geysers sand blows.
So we're talking about a lot of sand being blown up through the face of the earth, sometimes 100 feet high, and of course it's bringing up whatever is down there.
These sand volcanoes are the result of soil liquefaction. As the shaking, saturated earth compacts, pressure builds up until a vent or fissure is forced open. This brings the watery sand mixture blasting to the surface.
These things can be 15, 20 feet deep. You can still see evidence of these sand blows throughout the Boot Heel region of Missouri and down into the northeastern Arkansas.
Massive flooding along the river forced people to flee to higher ground.
The town of Little Prairie, which was actually hit harder than New Madrid in the first day of earthquakes, was flooded, and the town evacuated.
These people were scared to death. They had just witnessed a calamitous event, and they were moving across a landscape that they knew very well, but it had been so dramatically affected by the fissures, they would have been like a war zone.
Amazingly, the largest shock was yet to come. Their hell had only begun. The cities of Memphis and St. Louis lie in the heartland of America, a place of bedrock values and fertile farmlands. There is little concern for an obscure earthquake fault that cuts through the region. But if history can teach us anything, the next time this fault ruptures, it will turn Memphis and the entire Midwest into a mega disaster. It has happened before. Early on the morning of December 16, 1811, an 8.0 earthquake erupting near the community of New Madrid, Missouri, shook the ground for hundreds of miles in all directions. Aftershocks continued to rumble through the area over the next month. Residents abandoned their splintered cabins and set up makeshift shelters, with temperatures hovering just below freezing. Still, the shaking continued.
The earth stayed in motion for quite a long time, as much as a month.
After people calmed down, they began to rebuild, only to be terrorized again.
Then on January 23rd, 1812, there was another monstrous earthquake. And it created very much the same type of hysteria that resulted from the December 16th quake.
These were shocking events, but only precursors of what was to come. Frightened residents believed they were suffering the wrath of God.
All of a sudden, the hand of God comes down and strikes right where you're at. There's just a natural tendency to take that as a sign that maybe you need to clean up your act, and certainly that happened at New Madrid. The ground was in a constant state of unrest with the aftershocks. They just had the sense that it was moving almost constantly.
Then, on February 7, 1812, the New Madrid Fault unleashed its most violent earthquake to date, 8+ on the Richter scale.
February 7th is what the locals called the hard shock, which is kind of amazing. By all accounts, the biggest earthquake of the sequence. The fault crossed the Mississippi River in 3 different places.
The region, which had been under so much stress and strain, could handle no more. This third earthquake generated a new round of bizarre events. More sand blows, foul vapors, and collapsing riverbanks. Incredibly, 3,000 square miles of land east of the Mississippi River subsided, in some places by 10 feet. Enormous amounts of water from the Mississippi poured into the depressed area and formed a massive lake in just a few hours. These floodwaters covered a dense hardwood forest and killed all of the trees except the bald cypress, which thrive in water. This body of water, called Reelfoot Lake, still exists today. Pictures taken just 70 years ago during a seasonal drought show hundreds of stumps just below the surface. The bald cypress left in these waters tell the story of this instant lake.
Well, the bald cypress has a big root system called knees, and they have a bulb that grows at the water level. One of the interesting aspects of the subsidence and why we know that it was 3 feet of subsidence is that after the earthquakes over the next 10 to 20 years, these trees grew a second bulbous area 3 feet above the previous one.
Severe aftershocks continued for several months. By the time it was over, the region had endured more than 2,000 quakes and aftershocks, the most intense series of quakes ever experienced in North America. No one knows how many died because the area was sparsely settled.
From the eyewitness accounts, I've been able to pinpoint about 100 deaths in the New Madrid earthquake series. I think it's quite possible that there could have been a number more than that, say maybe as many as 500, because there had to have been many people on the river who were just never accounted for, because so many boats were lost on the river.
It would take some time before things returned to normal in the region.
For at least a year afterwards, many of the residents of New Madrid lived in a tent city. Other people left the area, but soon they started drifting back, as people are wont to do.
After a century of relative quiet, memories of these quakes faded, and cities were built up again with little knowledge of the hazard in the earth below. Some, like Memphis, are dangerously close to the faults that erupted in 1812.
If we had a series of New Madrid quakes today comparable to what happened 200 years ago, the effect on infrastructure like highways and bridges could be cataclysmic.
Can the lessons of the New Madrid quake help us prepare for this disaster of the future? Our experts will investigate the geologic record to more accurately predict the looming Midwest megaquake, an 8.0 killer. And then, this massive cataclysm will be brought to life. Most people assume that in the U.S., destructive earthquakes only occur in the western states. They are wrong. St. Louis, Missouri is actually located near the most active seismic zone east of the Rocky Mountains. This puts the gateway city and a population of nearly 2 million in the crosshairs of a devastating shaker. Just 150 miles south of the city and 15 miles beneath the Earth's surface lies the New Madrid Fault, ready to deliver an 8-point earthquake that will topple buildings, buckle highways, destroy bridges, and create a mega disaster across the region. Casualties could number more than 10,000. And it's not just St. Louis. Memphis, Tennessee will be affected by this same fault.
The U.S. Geological Survey has recently conducted very comprehensive surveys of both of these. They're both very dangerous places, and the administrations in both of those cities don't want to know.
Nearly 200 years ago, people in this region had first-hand experience with not just one, but a series of monster quakes. The United States Geological Survey has plotted worldwide earthquakes from the last 50 years. A great majority of them fall into a predictable pattern.
Most earthquakes in the world occur along plate boundaries, where two tectonic plates are moving past one another, and as they try to move, the rocks resist until they break and you have earthquakes.
But there is an active earthquake area located in southeastern Missouri on the banks of the Mississippi, the New Madrid seismic zone. 4,000 earthquakes registered here over the last 20 years, and no one knows exactly why.
The theory of plate tectonics provides an excellent explanation as to why we have earthquakes over most of the world. But it doesn't explain why we have earthquakes right in the middle of a plate. It violates what the theory would suggest.
Though not part of a plate boundary, there is some evidence that there may be an ancient fault line under New Madrid, now buried beneath 3,000 feet of Mississippi sediment.
This entire part of the United States is under compression from essentially the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, and the pressure of that pushing all the way through this area. We know for a fact that underneath this area lies an ancient rift, a major fault system that is 600 million years old. These faults have been activated various times through history and have recently turned on.
Scientists are in a desperate race to discover when the New Madrid fault will erupt with a new series of earthquakes.
The problem today is that what was hitherto an unpopulated part of America is now very populated. And there are two cities that are most at risk. One is Memphis to the south, and one is St. Louis to the north.
And between these cities today lies a complex network of roads, bridges, and communication links. The geologic clock is ticking for New Madrid. Crisscrossing faults could erupt in a massive quake that would make the 1811 and 12 shakers seem like a dress rehearsal. Yet questions still loom over the Midwest. When will another earthquake erupt? And will the residents be ready? With three-dimensional geologic mapping technology, Roy Van Arsdale has modeled this subterranean world, hoping to find some answers.
Well, we're compiling all kinds of information that we can get in terms of deep information. This first screen is a digital elevation model, which is basically a rendition of the topography of the region. You have the Mississippi River floodplain in view there. And in fact, there's a little gold star that shows where we're sitting right now in Memphis, Tennessee.
Using sound waves, scientists determine the composition of the rocks and subsoil. A geological snapshot of the terrain under the Mississippi sediments. This second layer is 5 miles below the surface.
We're looking at what's called the Precambrian surface in this multicolored depiction. And what you can also see is that the Precambrian geology is broken by faults. That's what these plains are that displace that surface. And there are earthquakes occurring along these two particular faults. These faults are oriented in such a way that it looks like they are trending towards Memphis and Shelby County, the star in the model. So we expect that they probably do pass beneath where we are right now.
Next, they plot onto the geography the locations of earthquakes in the region since 1995.
There have been earthquakes occurring over a long period of time, but these are the earthquakes that are well located. With the earthquakes in this pseudo 3D projection, they look like a shotgun blast until you rotate the model. You can see that the earthquakes align themselves along a plane. What you're looking at now is the real foot fault, and the earthquakes are popping off along that fault plane.
There it is, the killer fault people want to ignore. Pretty small, just 149 miles long compared to the San Andreas Fault that stretches more than 700 miles. But it packs a devastating punch. because seismic waves travel easily through Midwest bedrock. Seismic intensity maps of the 1811 event show destructive shaking in each of these quakes, stretching for more than 350 miles from the epicenters on the New Madrid fault line.
Clearly, the New Madrid earthquakes were big events, and they were felt all the way to the Atlantic seaboard, and they really rocked the whole mid-continent. That makes them big, potentially damaging events and the kind of quakes that we really worry about.
The geologic record is sending a desperate but often ignored message to millions of people living in the New Madrid seismic zone.
If conditions stay the same as they've been for the past 1,000 years, another series of earthquakes comparable to the 1811 and 1812 series is inevitable.
It's just a matter of time until a series of great quakes, bigger than the 1906 San Francisco disaster, will destroy a number of cities, with damages that will exceed $200 billion. And a death toll that will overshadow all other American tragedies.
Well, regrettably, what happened with Katrina shows that America is not prepared for a disaster anywhere.
The Midwest is in danger of being destroyed by a major earthquake. It may be hard to believe that this peaceful region is in jeopardy, but the numbers tell a different story.
We have about 11 million people at risk in the central U.S. Memphis and St. Louis are our two major urban centers. Each of them respectively have about 1.5 million, 2 million people. The bulk of the 11 million is about 7 million, which fall in the rural areas throughout the central U.S., which, as you see, a lot of them are right in these areas which are most vulnerable to shaking.
With 6 major rivers crossing the New Madrid seismic zone, damage to bridges and highways will paralyze transportation corridors, leaving thousands of people stranded and supplies going nowhere. The cities of St. Louis and Memphis are densely populated targets of a future 8.0 earthquake along the New Madrid fault. The only question now is when. Scientists are investigating the past in the hope of giving people some warning before the imminent megadisaster. Scattered across the New Madrid zone, there are scars of past seismic eruptions. Sand blows that formed during the 1811-1812 quakes still dot the landscape and make it difficult to grow a solid field of cotton.
The sand blows are very common, especially in the heart of the New Madrid seismic zone, close to the New Madrid faults.
Paleoseismologist Marticia Tuttle digs into sand blows, searching for clues as to the frequency of the past quakes.
I started working in the New Madrid seismic zone in 1992, and at the time the conventional wisdom was that no prior New Madrid events had occurred for 10,000 years.
Today, Professor Tuttle joins archaeologist Marion Haynes to excavate a trench in the middle of a cotton field. Digging into the soil, they uncover a very large sand blow.
The sand blow starts here. It's thin. It's getting thicker. The buried soil is about 4 feet deep. Here's another beautiful vent area. The sand blow's thinning, and it ends about there.
This sand blow is more than 63 feet wide on the surface.
The exact magnitude of the 1811-1812 events is debatable, but the effects that it had in the New Madrid seismic zone are irrefutable. And come to the field and see the ground failure that occurred, the sand blows that formed, and you'll see that these were no small events. This would be the plow zone, and that's an agricultural horizon resulting from plowing of the fields. This sand blow formed in 1811-1812 because there's essentially no soil left above it. The plowing of the fields has destroyed what little soil had developed, and it takes time to develop a soil.
Professor Tuttle suspects there may be deeper prehistoric sand blows that may hold evidence of earlier quakes. To locate older sites, she brings in a ground-penetrating radar specialist. After roping off a grid, Jamie drags the radar antenna over the ground. The radar measures soil resistance and produces this image of the subterranean world. Professor Tuttle suspects these white areas are sand blows. Excavating at this site, she finds a very unusual pattern in this sand blow. Soil with Native American artifacts, a layer known as an occupation horizon.
In this occupation horizon, there are lots of ceramic artifacts. Where we have an occupation horizon above a sand blow and a sand dike, we know that the feature is prehistoric in age. By doing artifact analysis, we'll be able to constrain the age of the earthquake.
Carbon dating charcoal remnants in the soil indicates that Native Americans occupied this land in about 1400 AD. The amount of soil above the sand blow provides another clue. It takes hundreds of years for this layer to accumulate. This sand blow must have erupted centuries before the 1812 earthquake. Professor Tuttle has made a major discovery. This is indeed earthquake country.
At this point, we've established that New Madrid-type earthquakes have occurred in this region around 900 AD and 1450 AD. There's some evidence for an event around 300 AD, and there's very strong evidence for an even earlier event around 2350 BC.
Based on Professor Tuttle's work, we now know the New Madrid Fault unleashes a major earthquake every 300 to 500 years. It has been nearly 200 years since the great quakes of 1811 and 1812. Time is running out to prepare for the next disaster. With both Memphis and St. Louis clearly targets of another mega disaster, scientists and engineers scrambled to be ready for the coming earthquake. The Missouri Department of Transportation is retrofitting some of the bridges and highways in the area.
This is a vital link, obviously, commerce-wise and everything else, as far as crossing from Illinois into St. Louis.
This double-stacked freeway leading to a Mississippi crossing could pancake in the event of a large quake.
During the earthquake in San Francisco in the late 80s, that upper deck collapsed on top of the lower deck. We're trying to prevent that catastrophic loss of life. So that's the main reason why we're strengthening this bridge here.
In Memphis, there are major concerns about the Interstate 40 bridge spanning the Mississippi. Engineers are racing to strengthen the towers and road surface.
If that bridge were to fail, it wouldn't just affect Memphis, but it would affect the whole country because of the enormous volume of goods that go over that bridge.
The retrofit involved strengthening it and improving the connections and the bearings of the bridge, and strengthening the foundation and make sure better connection between the foundation and the structure. And they came up with this innovative design which they use pendulum isolation bearings, and they isolate the superstructure from the structure below it.
2 years behind and still not completed, the I-40 bridge is expected to withstand shaking up to 7.7 on the Richter scale. 1 mile south, the I-55 bridge is not a great candidate for retrofitting. Cheaper to build a new one once the earthquake knocks this one down. Throughout the Midwest, engineers are frantically working to make buildings safer. Some corporations, like AutoZone in Memphis, have chosen to utilize the latest seismic protections in their new buildings, base isolators. The building is constructed on giant rubber plugs inserted into the foundation. These plugs absorb ground motions, and building shaking is minimized.
That is their corporate headquarters, and their data center is within that building. So all of their stores, processing of data and orders comes into that building. And that's why it was critically important for them to consider base isolation for their building there in Memphis.
Steel frame high-rises built in the last 20 years will be okay because they are engineered to bend with the strain, though their contents and people will be shaken. Wooden residential buildings are mostly flexible and will handle the shaking, but unreinforced brick buildings are death traps.
Every earthquake that I've ever been to, the buildings that go down initially first and the hardest seem to be unreinforced masonry buildings.
The east side of St. Louis by the river is literally filled with unreinforced brick buildings and row houses. Memphis has a large number of brick buildings in the downtown area that will collapse in a major quake.
For a repeat of an 1811 and 12 size earthquakes, and over the next 50 years, we estimate there's about a 7 to 10% chance of that occurring. For a smaller earthquake, a magnitude 6 or greater, the chances are much higher, about 25 to 40%.
The doomsday clock is ticking for 1 million square miles of the Midwest. A killer earthquake will soon strike with a 5-figure death toll and a 12-figure damage estimate. By employing the latest scientific data and computer graphics, we will create that disaster from its first jarring moments to its thundering finale. The clock is ticking for people in the New Madrid seismic zone. A massive earthquake affecting an 8-state region of the Midwest is on its way. Using historical data and expert predictions, you will be an eyewitness to a mega disaster that tears open the New Madrid Fault, exactly as it did in 1811. 9 a.m., perhaps tomorrow, New Madrid, Missouri. 5 miles beneath the surface, massive upheavals and fissures break along the New Madrid Fault, stretching from Arkansas to Illinois. The ground rumbles and starts to shake, and it doesn't stop. For 80 interminable seconds, it churns the ground violently, a magnitude 8 earthquake. Thousands of panicked office workers are tossed and terrorized in their work cubicles. For most, this is their first earthquake. Truck traffic grinds to a halt, and bridges and overpasses crack. The first things to be destroyed are several vital bridges across the Mississippi. In Memphis, Tennessee, 50 miles south of the fault, liquefaction near the river collapses unreinforced masonry structures. Debris clogs the streets.
I would anticipate unreinforced masonry buildings, even facade-covered buildings, suffering extensive damage. You're going to have the facades peeling off, unreinforced masonry buildings probably pulling their walls away and collapsing.
Some buildings with earthquake protection will ride out the shaking. But emergency personnel will not be able to navigate the debris-choked streets. Ground faulting disrupts runways at the Memphis airport, bringing shipping to a halt and creating a transportation nightmare. 150 miles north in St. Louis, high-rise buildings are heavily shaken in the quake. Seismic waves moving through hard mid-continent rocks travel hundreds of miles without losing strength. The soil under the city of St. Louis is a major factor in the level of destruction.
The majority of its downtown area is right close to the river. So in St. Louis, you can see that's got the red. A lot of the infrastructure coming in there on the highways is also in that same area.
Seismic waves traveling farther and faster, just as in 1811, damage buildings over 350 miles away. 1,000 miles east, the Atlantic seaboard gets shaken just 5 minutes after the initial shock. From St. Louis to Memphis, the Mississippi River, choked with debris, bombards levees and earthen banks. Houses are swept away and boats are thrown ashore.
We have
hints of the types of damage we could expect along the rivers based on the actual observations of the 1811-1812, where we had a tremendous amount of landsliding, debris deposited into the rivers. All that's going to be coming downriver. It's going to be hitting bridges, going to be hitting supports, potentially taking the bridge out.
Where the New Madrid Fault crosses under the Mississippi River, upheavals create chaos in the water. When a massive island blocks the downstream flow, the water, just as it did in 1811, charges back upstream. Mysterious fissures open up in the earth, and geysers of water and sand shoot into the sky as they did in 1811. Like the pioneers, people are terrified by this otherworldly phenomenon. It seems the world is coming apart. In an eerie replay of 1811, gaping holes open in the ground, swallowing everything, from people to parked cars.
We have major levees along the rivers which would be broken, breached. We have railroads and highways and so forth. So when you have permanent ground deformation, you are deforming those man-made objects and tearing them up in the process.
Natural gas pipelines break and spread the disaster across 5 states.
We have a number of major gas line facilities, pumping stations, lines that come through the central U.S. We're talking 30, 40-inch lines that are running through these areas that are vulnerable.
The disruption in supply will affect Chicago and the entire Northeast. Those who survive the intense ground shaking and the collapsing buildings look to the sky. Thick columns of smoke are the first warning of a new disaster. Something the 1811 residents never had to deal with: firestorm. White-hot sparks from downed electrical wires ignite clouds of natural gas. Fires break out all across Memphis. Firefighters respond where they can, but find hydrants dry. Underground water supply lines have been destroyed. Firefighters are only able to extinguish a small percentage of the fires raging throughout the city. A FEMA study estimates that a 7.7 quake will shatter and burn some 17,000 structures in Memphis, leaving more than 25,000 homeless. As in 1811, the earth continues to rumble and shake. Violent aftershocks surge across the region. 3 close to magnitude 8.0 in the first 24 hours. After that, tremors constantly rattle frayed nerves.
It's not just a cut and dried, here's the disaster, you deal with it and you move on. We've got the potential of repeated disasters in a short period of time.
Just when people think it's safe to return to their homes, a second quake strikes, damaging the already crumbling infrastructure.
How do you deal with a housing issue? How do you deal with recovery from an event when you've got the potential a week later, 2 weeks later, a couple months later being hit again? So that's the challenge we have in the central U.S.
A third and final big quake, an 8.0 like February of 1812, causes major ground failure and upheaval. Throughout the region, rivers are blocked or turned out of their banks. They create new lakes or inundate small cities. As these killer quakes and thousands of aftershocks bigger than San Francisco's 1906 quake break across the 8-state region, America will face terror and death on a scale never before seen for an extended 4-month period. Then, just as suddenly as they began, the quakes will end and the rebuilding will begin. In a worst-case scenario, the death toll will top 20,000, but possibly grow to 80,000 if levees collapse and floodwaters add to the grim total. 500,000 people will be injured, and as many as 10 million could be left homeless. Property damage in the 8-state region will be in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Life in the region will never be the same. The small tremors and rumblings from the depths of the New Madrid Fault are a warning that the massive forces that destroyed the Midwest in 1811 and 1812 are ready to be unleashed again.